Keeping with the theme of politics here, Idaho pushes for a convention of states, a bold move towards constitutional amendments. This comes by several sources. In a significant political development, Idaho has joined the ranks of states advocating for the Convention of States as outlined under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. This initiative aims to propose an amendment to the Constitution, focusing on imposing financial restraints on the federal government, limiting its power and jurisdiction, and setting term limits for federal officials and members of Congress. This move affects Idaho's growing concern over the federal government's expanding reach and perceived erosion of states' rights and fiscal responsibility. The Convention of States project is a national movement that requires the support of 34 states to call a convention and 38 states to ratify any proposed amendments. The Idaho proposals are part of a broad effort, underscoring the state's commitment to reining in federal overreach and restoring a balance of power more in line with the founders' original intent. Advocates argue that such a convention is necessary to address systemic issues that elections alone cannot solve, such as national debt, corruption, and federal government's encroachment on individual liberties and state sovereignty. Critics, however, have expressed concern about the potential for runaway convention, end quote, that could lead to unintended changes to the Constitution. They fear that opening the Constitution to amendment in this manner could result in significant alterations to the document's core principle and protections. Despite these concerns, supporters in Idaho and elsewhere believe that the safeguards within Article 5 process, particularly in the high threshold for ratification, mitigate the risk of a runaway convention. As Idaho pushes forward with the proposal, the debate continues both within the state and across the nation. Proponents see this as a critical step towards fiscal responsibility, limited government, and enhanced state autonomy. Opponents caution against the unpredictable nature of such a convention. Regardless of the outcome, Idaho's involvement in the Convention of States project marks a pivotal moment in the ongoing discussion about the balance of power between the federal government and states and the best path forward for the United States. Which, a lot to unpack there. I actually, until this article came across my radar, had no idea that there was such a thing moving forward with the name of the project again.
Yeah, I heard probably Ben Shapiro talking about it, even all the way back during Trump's presidency. They've been talking about this. I know the Daily Wire's been after it for I don't know, the last 8-9 years.
Against it or after?
For it. They were advertising for it for a while. And it's an interesting idea. And when you start talking about some of the things that could happen, you bring up things like term limits for the federal legislative branch.
Trying to increase turnover in the House and Congress.
So that's like the one biggest thing, but also budgetary and finance. Our federal government is running away with everything. I think it's a great idea, personally.
Well, I think we'll have an interesting discussion then.
Yeah, go for it. I've opened the floor.
You're like, all right, let's hear opposing counsel. No. No, I mean, the only thing I wanted to start off with is just giving it a little bit of perspective. Idaho as a state with the governor, right, has jumped on with the project, but Idaho has not passed a resolution to that effect yet to officially join that list.
Yeah, so they've started talking about it, but they haven't made a decision yet.
Right. So that was something I thought was kind of relevant in that respect. As for the tenets of it, obviously wanting to sit there and put some different boundaries and controls on it, and the argument of that foundation, which I grabbed a bit from their page here, which is national movement aimed to use state-led amendment process outlined in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to address issues like national debt and federal overreach. The movement is rooted in the belief that the federal government has exceeded, this is the part I'm going to come back later, its constitutional bounds, and that a convention is necessary to restore the balance of power more in line with the founders' original intent. Which, all of that sounds great to me. But my kind of iffy part, and I'm probably just being even more conservative in that respect, is that key part, exceed. The federal government has already exceeded the Constitution. I don't see why changing the Constitution is actually in the long run, or maybe even in the short term, going to make actually a lasting effect, because the Constitution we have it right now isn't being respected. And so what will any of those amendments be respected for?
Yeah, and there's certainly validity to that standpoint. I guess the question comes down to, when you have a broken system, how do you fix that broken system? And there's two ways to approach that. You can fix that system by the inside, by trying to get the system to fix itself, or you can try and fix the system from the outside to have someone from the outside change the rules that that system plays by.
Assuming you can get that system to obey those new rules.
Sure, but it's the same thing that's going on down in Texas right now. It's one of the same fundamental questions that was asked during the Civil War. Are we a collection of states that have formed together to form a union, or are we one country that is ruled from the top down?
Right.
But that's not how the United States was set up to operate and function. It was set up to operate and function as a unity of states, and those states have rights, they have obligations, as does the federal government. And if the federal government is not doing what the federal government is supposed to do, and then if the federal government is stepping on the states and doing what the states are supposed to do, then yeah, the federal government is broken. So like I alluded to, that's what's happening in Texas right now. The federal government is mandated with the protection of its borders. The federal government is not doing that right now. So Texas said, all right, as part of our Constitution, we, the state of Texas, are also mandated to protect our borders. We're going to step up and do it. Period. End of story. And the feds aren't going to get in our way. So in that situation, the feds clearly backed down. So if we go convention of states, will the feds do the same thing? That's their track record at this point. That's the precedent they've set. So again, the question of what happens if we tell the Fed that they have to abide by these rules and then they don't? Well, now that gives the states legal ammunition to come after the bad actors in the Fed who are not doing what they're supposed to do.
I guess the part that where you lose me there is that I feel like the federal government has already crossed lines with the existing U.S. Constitution, and states aren't doing that when they should be, and they have the ammunition to do it. So why are we wanting to mend, that's the word we're talking about right now, things to it? I'm more looking at it, I think the founders did a pretty good job, pretty bang-up job when it came to the structure of the United States and its Constitution. I would say the issue more lies not with the Constitution itself, but with the people involved in it. The people in that system, and that we need more good people to be involved, but you need to take action, grassroots. Going to that example with states keeping the federal government accountable and say we pass this and we have this ammunition, the states go for it. I would appeal or argue that if we had the civil involvement that you saw maybe 100 years ago in America, half the things the federal government has tried to do wouldn't have happened, because basically the scream line, local person screams to his local representative, that representative screams up the line, and before you know it, you have a bunch of states that are all acting, and it's not like, where's the corruption? No, all these people know, everyone is involved, everyone's watching me, everyone is very active in at least their local community, which screams up the line. So just because you say, well, I can't cover the state legislature, or I can't cover the federal government, can you be involved in your local county? If you can be involved in your local county and you scream at your local county, that goes up the ranks. And so with that idea of local civil involvement, I think is the cornerstone of actually solving this, not fundamentally trying to change certain amendments.
Which makes sense, and I agree with more people need to be involved in their local politics. More people need to pay attention to what's going on. But also, like the solution to that on a federal level, you talk about primarying people. But again, the problem with that is if you're going against the incumbent person who's been in office for 50 years, good luck. Absolutely try to beat him, but more than likely it's not going to happen. So yes, right. I agree that grassroots is a thing that must happen, but also at the very least, term limits need to happen.
I guess maybe the core of this that me and you are kind of dancing around is the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, sufficient, or is it not sufficient? That is the U.S. Constitution, sufficient enough, it fulfills all the roles it needs to fill, and then it's an issue of people problem, which is where I stand, or is it insufficient, that it lacks some writing, some aspects, some amendments to it, right, that it needs added to be sufficient? I feel like that's probably the where me and you are dancing.
Right. So I would say that the document itself is sufficient. The problem is the way that people are interpreting it to twist it into something that it is not.
Because of the change of language over time?
Correct. And so because of the way that people are changing language, they can now twist it to say something that is clearly antithetical. There's been a couple comments recently on our YouTube videos. Someone made the claim like, well, the Bill of Rights says a well-regulated militia, which means the army. And I want to say, no, you're wrong. The language at the time was, that's just the citizens. That's not saying that individuals must be a part of the army to therefore also own guns. And so, again, with the way these words are twisted, also, you talk to the same people, like, well, what firearms, what weapons are you allowed to possess? Can you possess a handgun? Can you possess a rifle? Can you possess a tank? Can you possess an aircraft carrier? Can you possess a nuclear bomb as an individual? Me, I'd say, yeah, you have the right to all of those things. And I would say that our forefathers would have said the same thing, because people came to them with cannons and with warships and said, hey, can I own that thing? And our federal government said, yeah. And so, again, it's that twisting of reality. That is what I think is the root cause of all of this. And so how do you solve that as a problem? Although having said that, I would still say that term limits on our federal legislators should be amended into the U.S. Constitution.
I mean, you're definitely getting me closer to it, John. I've heard that the argument for term limits, and it's something that's talked about a lot more lately, especially with the age of some senators and representatives lately. But I haven't quite come into the camp, but you make I will admit, a very, very good case. But one point I did want to touch on, it's one I've realized I don't think I've mentioned, and I honestly, I learned this in only like maybe the last year or so, that especially in a state like Idaho that's super red, the person who gets the R gets voted in, which is actually a really, really good thing as you as a person. Let me explain. I know people that have been able to go to the statewide Republican meetings, right, where they, decide, vote on, or endorse who those representatives are going to be, right? And they, for lack of a better word, they're barely in it for less than a year or two to just climb up through the ranks. That you're only like maybe 1-2 positions away from being able to vote and make a very decisive vote from actually affecting if Mike Simpson gets the nomination for the Republican Party, which is a huge effect that you say there and say, well, we need to primary someone. Well, cool. I would argue for Brad Little, for a lot of these people, as we get closer to their elections, I'm going to continue to encourage people, coming back on my civil involvement horse here, that you should really start at the Republican Party level. As much as you may hate them or love them, that is the point that if you want to look at the weakest link to affect which people get voted in or not, it's at that. But coming back to your point, definitely, it's a fair point about term limits. I see the benefit on one side. There's another side of me that here's the other argument, which is if you're constantly having so much rotation, right, within Congress and the House and Senate, I need to get my English correct, then you run into an issue that's kind of similar with the presidency, where one president says one thing to one country, right, says, yes, we'll uphold this, Russia, or whatever, right, and then down the line, another president gets in and completely revokes that and goes back on our word. Because, he's the president, he can do that type of thing. And so I could see that argument also makes sense to me when it comes to the House and Senate, where it's like, okay, yeah, we put term limits, but if we cause this rotation to be too often, then people really can't build up power, build up connections to actually move certain things and things to be consistent. But I'm not sure. I think it'll be interesting to see as the discussion goes on. But in any of it, I think if you have a current application, and maybe I think John might agree with me on this, we can find middle ground. For a current, like, what can you do now as an average citizen? Be civilly involved. And then we'll see where the rest of this national conversation with amendments goes and how that starts to look. And at least if you're civilly involved, then you can actually maybe have a say in that.
Yeah, to that I would absolutely agree. That is the place to start.
Right. Anywho, I think we had a really good conversation on this story. But definitely a longer one. The next one will also be fun because we're going to get into money.